They called it mercy, what they did to her. The chain was old iron, the kind used for livestock at the mountain fairs, and they locked it around her wrist in the great hall of Vorn Keep, while 300 witnesses watched and said nothing. The Alpha King stood at the far end of the dais, still as carved stone, his face giving nothing. He had ordered it. He did not look away when the lock clicked shut. They called her many things that night: breech-born, wolfless stray, the girl who had wandered out of the lower villages with her dead mother's healer kit, and her presumption. Lord Casvin, first counselor, said the last part aloud into the firelit hall, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to say it. She stood and let him finish, because the chain was new enough that fighting it would only amuse them. What they could not have known, what none of them knew yet except perhaps one, was that the Alpha King's wolf had already decided. And iron, as it turns out, is merely iron. If you have ever waited for the world to be wrong about someone, stay with this. The correction was not quiet. The year was 843 by the Vorn count, deep into the season the mountain packs called the Iron Moon, when the cold sets its teeth and does not release until the thaw fires are lit. Lena had been in service at Vorn Keep for 2 winters, and she had learned in that time to move through its halls the way water moves through cracks in stone, finding the path of least resistance, taking up no more room than necessary, surviving. She was 26 years old. She had no pack. That was the whole of her crime, in the eyes of the hierarchy. Her mother had died in a snowmelt flood when Lena was 11, leaving her a worn satchel of dried roots, a copper mortar, and a knowledge of wound binding that most trained healers twice her age did not possess. She had apprenticed herself to Braille, the old bone setter who worked the lower district of Vorn village, and she had learned from him everything he had: the poultices, the fever bark teas, the careful art of setting a broken bone so it knit true rather than crooked. When Braille died, she had kept his practice. When the village's Omega Pack dissolved after its Alpha was killed in a border dispute, she had found herself without affiliation, without a bond to any recognized bloodline or territory. In the hierarchy of the northern packs, that made her nothing. The keep had taken her on as a treatment aide the winter before last, because the head healer, a tight-mouthed woman named Doss, had needed hands that would work without complaint through the worst of the season's injuries, and Lena's hands were capable and cheap. She slept in a narrow room off the healer's ward, a room so small that her pallet occupied most of the floor, and the single window looked onto a stone interior wall and admitted roughly 2 hours of direct light each day at midsummer, less in the months when daylight was rationed by the mountains. She ate in the servants' hall, at the long table nearest the door. She did not attend pack ceremonies, was not permitted in the upper corridors after dark, and was addressed by the keep staff in the particular tone reserved for people who have no one to be offended on their behalf. The work itself, she did not mind. Wounds were wounds. A broken bone did not care who said it, and a fever did not refuse to break for an unaffiliated healer. She had treated a guard's septic hand the previous winter, and the man had walked away with full use of his fingers, and he had not thanked her exactly, but he had stopped being one of the voices that called her breech-born in the corridor, which she counted as equivalent. The pack's Omega-adjacent workers, the laundry women and stable hands and grain store keepers, had formed a cautious friendliness with her over 18 months. Small greetings in the hall, a shared crock of something warm on cold evenings. She had a name here, even if the name did not appear in any registry. She had made peace with most of it. She had not made peace with Casvin. Lord Casvin was first counselor of the Vorn Pack and had held that office for 11 years, since the old Alpha King's death and the rise of the current one. He was a man of considerable intelligence and no particular mercy, And he had built his power carefully over the course of a decade, embedding himself into the bureaucratic skeleton of the pack's governance, until removing him would require dismantling half the administration. He was not, technically, her enemy. She was too small for a man like Casvin to have enemies. But he had noticed her, which was worse. She did not know why, at first. She was an unaffiliated healer aide. She had nothing. But Casvin noticed things the way certain predators notice movement at the edge of their vision, and he had begun, 6 months prior, to pay attention to Lena in the way that powerful men pay attention to things they intend to remove. The Alpha King was another matter entirely. His name was Doran. He was 31 years old, had held the Vorn throne for 6 years following his predecessor's death in a territorial dispute with the Eastern clans, and he had the kind of presence that rearranged a room simply by entering it, not loudly. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. He was not the roaring, chest-beating kind of authority. He was the still kind, the kind that does not need to announce itself because the air in his vicinity becomes a different quality of air. She had been in the same room as him perhaps a dozen times before the night of the Iron Moon ceremony. She had tried, each time, not to look directly at him. She had not always succeeded. The Iron Moon ceremony was a pack tradition observed on the first full moon after the season's deepest cold. The Alpha King held open court in the Great Hall, and any pack member could bring a grievance before the assembled hierarchy. It was also the night on which violations of pack law were formally heard and sentenced. Most years it was dull. Petty disputes over grazing land, debt arrangements gone sour, the occasional challenge that fizzled before it could escalate. This year, Lena had been summoned. She had found the summons on the door of her small room 3 days prior, written in Casven's precise hand, naming her for a hearing on charges of unlicensed healing practice and theft of medical stores. She had read it twice, very carefully, noting that neither charge was technically true and that it did not matter. Casven had the witnesses. He had already written the verdict. On the morning of the ceremony, she had laid out her only decent dress, a gray wool with a patched left sleeve, and braided her hair back, and looked at herself in the small metal mirror above her washstand and thought, with the clarity of a woman who had seen this before, that she had been called to a verdict, not a hearing. She had known the difference since she was 13 years old and had watched the village council hold a hearing for a man whose land they had already decided to take. The posture of deliberation, the closed verdict beneath it. She had learned to recognize the shape. She was brought into the hall by a junior guard named Torvel, who had once come to her with a shoulder that had slipped its joint and left without offering payment, and who now walked slightly ahead of her and slightly to the left, as if trying to position himself not quite adjacent to what was about to happen. She did not blame him. She would have done the same. The Great Hall of Vorn Keep held 300 people on a ceremony night, and every seat was filled by the time Lena was brought forward. Torch flames lined the stone walls at intervals, throwing long orange shadows across the gathered pack. The dais at the far end held the Alpha King's carved chair, and Doran occupied it with the absolute stillness she had come to recognize from a distance. Casven stood to his left. The 3 senior council members stood to his right. Lena was placed at the center of the floor. The assembled hall looked at her the way assemblies look at things that are not expected to survive the looking. Casven spoke for a long time. He was very good at it. He named the charges with a precision that made them sound serious, cited the regulations she had allegedly violated, produced 2 witnesses who confirmed details that were either invented or heavily distorted, and concluded by recommending that she be formally stripped of her healer's designation and remanded to the keep's warden cells for a period of 30 days, to be released only upon the Alpha King's direct order. In practice, this meant she would be chained. The warden cells were used for two purposes in Vorn Keep: storing pack property and punishing those the hierarchy wished to humiliate without formally executing. The chain was the humiliation part. The Alpha King had not spoken throughout. He sat in his carved chair with his hands open on his knees and his expression carefully, deliberately neutral. And Lena, standing at the center of the hall with 300 witnesses at her back, looked at his face and tried to read it. She found nothing she recognized as mercy. "The Alpha King concurs," Casvin announced, with the smooth authority of a man who had long since arranged for that to be true. "With the Council's recommendation." The chain went on at the wrist. The lock clicked. Someone in the assembly laughed, low and satisfied, and Lena did not turn to find the face. She was taken to the warden's level that night, a floor below the healer's ward, where the stone was older and the walls wept with cold. The cell was not large. It had a pallet, a water crock, and an iron ring in the wall where the chain's other end was fixed. The warden, a heavy-set man named Porvis, locked the ring without meeting her eyes and left without speaking. Lena sat on the pallet and listened to the keep settle around her. She was not afraid. She was, which she acknowledged privately, furious, but she had learned long ago that fury without a lever is just heat, and she had no levers. What she had was time. 30 days. She would endure 30 days, and then she would leave Vorn Keep, and she would not come back. The cell was not built for prolonged occupation. The stone sweated in the deep cold, a slow seep that darkened the lower walls and collected in the joints between the flags. The iron ring in the wall was old, its surface pitted with the slow rust of decades, and the chain that connected it to her wrist was perhaps 6 feet of length, giving her a radius that encompassed the pallet, the water crock, and the cell bars, and nothing else. She could not reach the torch bracket in the corridor. She had no light of her own after Porvis took the lamp. She spent the first hours cataloging what she knew and what she did not, the way she cataloged a patient's symptoms before treating, systematically, without catastrophizing, assigning each piece its correct weight. She knew Casvin had planned this. She knew the charges were fabricated. She knew that the Alpha King had, at minimum, not actively intervened, which told her either that he believed the charges or that he believed them to be the Council's jurisdiction and not his. Neither possibility was useful to her right now. She knew she had 30 days. She knew the cell was survivable. She knew she was very cold. She lay down on the pallet and pulled the single blanket around her shoulders and slept. What she had not accounted for was the sound she heard at roughly the 3rd hour of the night. It came from the corridor outside her cell, not from the direction of the stairs, but from the far end of the passage where an exterior iron door opened onto the keep's outer yard. A low sound, rhythmic and deliberate, a scraping, almost. She lay still on her pallet and listened, and after a moment she placed it. Something large was working at the base of the exterior door. She rose and moved to the bars of her cell and looked into the dimness of the corridor. In the narrow gap under the exterior door, in the faint cold light that filtered through from the yard, she could see movement. Something pressing against the iron, something methodical. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. There are stories, in the northern packs, about the wolves that run alongside alpha bloodlines. They are not pets. They are not companions in the way a village dog is a companion. They are something older and less manageable, a second self that the pack hierarchies acknowledge and cannot fully control, and the strongest of them are said to be capable of acts that no trained animal should be capable of: finding the hidden, crossing the locked, breaking what ought not to break. The Alpha King's wolf was black, and large in the way that suggested something other than ordinary wolf in its lineage, and it had been chewing at the base of the outer door with the concentrated focus of an animal that had made a decision and intended to see it through. She stood at her cell bars for a long moment, watching. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. The wolf stopped its work. A pause. Then a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl, but occupied the narrow register between them. "If you are still watching, stay close. What comes next takes time to become what it is. But it becomes something enormous." Lena sat back down on her pallet. The sound resumed. In the morning, when Porvis came with water and a bowl of porridge that was mostly cold, the outer door's lower iron band had been scored deeply, bent outward at one corner, and the door itself was ajar by the width of 3 fingers. The wolf was gone. Porvis stared at the door for a long time, then at Lena, then closed it without speaking. That was the first crack. The second came on the 4th day, when the Alpha King himself appeared in the corridor outside her cell. He came alone, which was not the custom. The Alpha King did not visit warden cells alone. He had guards, a second in command, a protocol that required witnesses even for minor administrative acts. He came alone, in plain traveling clothes, rather than the formal layered wool she had seen him wear in the Great Hall. And he stood outside the bars of her cell and looked at her with the expression she had spent weeks trying to decode and had never managed. She stood. She did not bow. She was chained to a wall, and the gesture would have been undignified. "You're the healer aide," he said. It was not a question. "I was?" she said. "Technically, I've been stripped of the designation." Something moved across his face. Not quite humor. Something harder than that. "Casvin's recommendation was based on testimony from Woolen the provision keeper and his brother," Doran said. "Woolen has a history of providing testimony in exchange for favorable account settlement." "I know," Lena said. "You know? I've worked in a healer's ward for 2 winters. I know who Porvis drinks with. I know how the provision accounts run. I knew about Woolen before the summons." She looked at him steadily. It didn't matter. The pause that followed was long enough to have a shape. He looked at her the way she had seen him look at structural problems in the keep. The compromised archway in the east wing, the drainage question in the lower yard, with the focused attention of a man assessing load-bearing weight. A longer silence fell. She held it with him. The corridor was cold in the particular way of stone spaces that the sun never reached, and the torch in the bracket behind him threw his shadow long against the far wall, and she thought, he is deciding something. Not whether the charges were false. He knew that, or he would not be here. Something else. Something he had not yet committed to naming. 30 days, he said. "So I've been informed." He left without another word, but he did not leave immediately. He stood outside her cell for one more moment, something held very precisely in check behind his eyes, and then he turned and walked back down the corridor, and Lena stood in the quiet he left and tried to name what she had seen in his face. She settled finally on the word she had been avoiding: conflict. The days that followed were not comfortable, but they were not the silent blankness she had expected. Porvis grew increasingly unsettled. Her water was replaced more frequently. The porridge improved. She did not think these things were accidents. On the 7th night, the wolf came back. This time, it came through the outer door entirely, which should not have been possible given the lock that Porvis had checked and rechecked since the first morning. The lock was on the floor inside the corridor, intact, inexplicably open. The wolf moved through the passage with the silence of something that had decided the barriers between it and where it intended to be were advisory rather than binding, and it pressed itself against the bars of her cell and breathed against her hand. She sat with it for a long time. It smelled of cold iron and pine resin and something she had no name for. Something that pressed against the back of her sternum when she breathed it in. A warmth that had no business existing in a stone cell in the deep of the iron moon season. She told herself it was proximity. She told herself she was lonely and that animals were warm, and that she was reading significance into the behavior of a wolf that had simply found an interesting smell and followed it. Her inner awareness did not agree. It clawed at something very specific, a recognition that landed nowhere she was willing to let it land, and she pressed her hand against the wolf's broad skull and chose deliberately not to follow the thread. She focused instead on what she could observe. The wolf's coat was black and dense, built for mountain winters, and it was massive in a way that disrupted her sense of scale in the narrow corridor. Its shoulders sat level with the iron bars at the height she rested her hand. Its eyes, when it turned them on her, were a color she had no precise word for. Somewhere between gold and pale amber, lit from within in a way torchlight alone could not account for. It did not growl. It did not circle or pace. It simply sat, and then lay, pressing its length against the bars as if the bars were an obstacle it was tolerating rather than accepting. At some point past the second hour, she had stopped measuring the time. The cold in the cell was the same cold it had always been, but it registered differently. The way cold registers differently when one is not entirely alone. She sat with her back against the bars and the wolf's warmth at her shoulder and listened to the keep breathe around them and thought, with careful precision, about everything she was not yet permitting herself to conclude. The wolf stayed until the first gray seep of dawn and then was gone. On the 9th day, Casvin came. He came with 2 junior council members at his back, and the particular smile of a man paying a social call on someone he has already defeated. He stopped outside her cell with his hands folded behind him and looked at her the way one looks at something one has filed away. "How are you finding the accommodations?" he said. Lena said nothing. "I want to be clear," Casvin said in a lower voice, shifting so that the 2 junior members were slightly behind him, "about what your situation is. You have no pack. You have no bond. You have no legal standing in the Vorn hierarchy, and no one to advocate for your release. The Alpha King has confirmed the Council's recommendation. In 21 days, you will be released onto the road with nothing, and that will be the end of your tenure in Vorn territory." He paused. "I want you to understand that clearly, whatever you may believe about your standing here." "Whatever I may believe," she repeated. "Healers' aids form attachments," he said, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. "It's a professional hazard. They mistake proximity for connection. I want you to be clear, before you leave, that there is no connection. There is only proximity. And proximity ends." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you warning me?" she said slowly. "Or are you afraid of something?" His smile did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way current shifts under ice, and he turned and walked back down the corridor. And she stood in the cold and listened to his footsteps diminish and thought, with a cold certainty, he knows. He knew about the wolf. She turned this over carefully for the rest of that day. If Casvin knew, the situation was different from what she had assumed. An Alpha King's wolf did not chew through locked iron doors for people the Alpha King had ordered chained. The wolf's behavior was not, could not be, random. And if Casvin had noticed it, then Casvin had a problem he had not anticipated when he constructed his case against her, and a man like Casvin did not ignore problems. He resolved them. That night she lay on her pallet and looked at the ceiling and thought about the lock that had been intact but open on the floor, and the door that should not have admitted a wolf the size of a small horse, and the warmth in her chest when she breathed a particular combination of iron and pine and something nameless. She thought about the Alpha King's face outside her cell bars, the word conflict, the precision with which he had held something in check. She thought, with something close to calm, that this was not going to resolve the way Casvin thought it would. She was right, but the resolution was not yet visible, and the night before it became visible was the worst one. On the 14th day, Casvin moved. He came to her cell in the middle of the night with Porvis and 2 pack guards, and he presented a document with the Alpha King's seal at the bottom. He read it aloud with care, and what it said was as follows. The healer aide Lena, having demonstrated no grounds for early release, would be transferred from Vorn Keep to the Outer Warden Station at the Mountain Pass, there to complete the remainder of her sentence, after which she would be released north of the Boundary Stones and forbidden re-entry to Vorn territory for a period of 5 years. She read the document herself when he offered it. The seal was real. She had seen that seal enough times to know it. The Alpha King confirmed this? She said. His seal is on the document, Casvin said. She looked at the seal for another moment. Something was wrong. She did not know enough about the inner workings of the Keep's administrative process to name it precisely, but she had spent 2 winters watching the way things were documented here, and the seal placement was wrong. It sat at the bottom right where a co-signatured order would be placed, not where a primary order would be placed, and there was no secondary line. She handed the document back. No, she said. Casvin's expression did not flicker. You don't have a choice in the matter. I'm making one anyway. She moved back to her pallet and sat down. If the Alpha King wants me moved, he can come and say so. Porvis made a sound. One of the guards shifted. Casvin looked at her for a long, measuring moment, and she watched him do the calculation, whether forcing her physically was worth the noise, whether the guards would comply with an order that had not come directly from the Alpha King's mouth, how much latitude he had before this particular move became a problem rather than a solution. He turned and left. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the pallet with her back to the wall and the chain on her wrist, and she thought through everything she knew and everything she did not know, and she arrived, by the first gray light of morning, at a conclusion that frightened her. Casvin had the seal. He had either forged it or obtained it by means he should not have had. Either way, he was operating outside the bounds of what the Alpha King had actually authorized, and if he was willing to do that, the 30-day sentence was not the limit of what he intended. He was trying to get her out of the keep before the Iron Moon passed, because something happened at the end of the Iron Moon season, and whatever it was, he did not want her present for it. She needed to reach the Alpha King. She had one night. The wolf came at the 2nd hour. She heard it before she saw it, the same scraping against the outer door, but faster this time, more urgent. When the door gave, the wolf came through at nearly a run and pressed itself against her cell bars with a force that rattled the iron, and she went to it immediately and put both hands on its skull and said, quietly and clearly, I need you to understand something. The wolf went still. Whatever Casvin is planning, she said, he has one night to do it, because after tonight I think someone is going to look at that document and ask questions it can't answer. But I can't reach the Alpha King from in here. I can't do anything from in here. She paused. She was talking to a wolf. She was also aware, in some part of her that had been quietly certain for 8 days, that she was talking to something more than a wolf. I need the door. The wolf looked at her. In the dimness, its eyes were pale amber, almost luminous. Then it turned and looked at the lock on her cell door. She had made a decision, standing at those bars in the dark with her chain around her wrist and her hands on a wolf's skull. She had decided that whatever the risk was, she would rather pay it than let Casvin move her to the mountain pass, because whatever was at the mountain pass was not 30 days and a road north. She was certain of that, the way she was certain of a bone that had set wrong. She could feel the misalignment without needing to be told. The wolf chewed through the cell lock in 14 minutes. She counted. It was not quick, and it was not neat, and the sound of it was the sound of something refusing to accept that iron was a sufficient barrier, and when the lock finally gave and the cell door swung open, she was aware that the sound had been considerable, and that if Porvis was on the warden floor, he would have heard it. She listened for footsteps. None came. The warden level was quiet in the way of a floor that has only one keeper, and Porvis kept particular hours. She put her free hand on the wolf's flank. The muscle under her palm was dense and warm and very still, like a coiled thing that has chosen patience over motion. She felt, beneath the warmth, the particular steadiness of an animal that has accomplished what it came to accomplish and is waiting for what comes next. "The Alpha King," she said quietly. "Where is he?" The wolf moved. She followed. She was still chained at the wrist, the chain trailing behind her from the broken ring. She carried it looped in her free hand to keep it from dragging on the stone flags. The wolf moved through the keep with the certainty of something that knew every corridor by scent, taking routes she had not known existed. A back passage between the old storeroom and the inner wall, a stair that did not appear on any map she had seen, a landing that smelled of cold air and old smoke, and somewhere above it, lamplight. She had lived in this keep for 2 winters, and she had not known these passages. She wondered briefly how many other things about this keep she had not been permitted to know. The wolf stopped before a heavy carved door on which no guard stood, which in itself told her something had already gone wrong in the keep's normal order. She knocked. The door opened before she finished the motion. Doran was dressed, which meant he had not slept. He was holding a folded document, and when he saw her, something moved through his face with such velocity and force that she had to hold herself very still to keep from stepping back. He looked at the chain. His jaw tightened. "Casvin came to me last night," she said, "with a document bearing your seal. It ordered my transfer to the mountain pass." A silence. "I did not issue a transfer order," Doran said. "I know," she said. "The seal placement was wrong. It was signed as a co-authorizing signature, not a primary order." He either forged the primary or he obtained a blank signed sheet and wrote the text himself. She paused. "I think he has your seal." The stillness in the room changed quality. The wolf pressed against her side. Doran looked at it for one moment. Something in his expression she could not parse, and was not sure she was meant to, and then he crossed to a writing table and opened the lower drawer and looked at what was inside for a long time without speaking. Then he turned back to her. 12 days ago," he said, "I lost a signed document from that drawer. I believed I had simply misfiled it. I now understand that I was wrong." She nodded. "He has been building this," she said, "for longer than the charges against me. I don't think I was the original plan. I think I became useful to him because of something he noticed, about the wolf's behavior." She stopped. She looked at the wolf. She looked back at him. Doran was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known," he said, "what that meant?" She looked at the chain on her wrist. She thought about 14 minutes of iron being refused. She thought about the warmth in her sternum she had been calling proximity for 8 days. "Long enough," she said. The night that followed was the kind that does not feel like hours but like a single sustained breath held past the point of comfort. Doran moved through his keep with the controlled velocity of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has reached the end of that patience. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He sent word to his beta, a quiet man named Aldrich, who appeared in the upper corridor within minutes, took one look at Lena's chain, and set his jaw in a particular way that said he had been waiting for this with some patience of his own. They found the forged document in Casvin's chamber. They found the blank signed sheets, 3 of them, taken from the drawer in Doran's writing room over the course of the past month. They found, in a locked correspondence box, letters exchanged with a council member of the Eastern Territory, outlining an arrangement by which Casven would ensure a vacancy at the Vorn Alpha seat within the season, in exchange for a position of considerable power in the merged administration that would follow. Aldrich read the letters in the small hours of the morning with the expression of a man confirming something he had suspected and hoped to be wrong about. He set each letter down with care, as if the care were the only thing he could offer against what they said. He had served under 2 Alpha Kings. He had believed in the administrative integrity of the Vornpak Council, with the particular faith of a man who has watched institutions hold through difficult seasons and attributed that holding to their structure rather than their luck. He looked up from the last letter. "How long?" he said to Doran, not asking. "Long enough," Doran said, which meant longer than he had let himself believe. Casvin had not been planning to humiliate Lena. He had been planning to kill the Alpha King. The humiliation had been incidental. She had been chained because her presence in the healer's ward gave her access to the keep's medical stores, and Casvin had wanted her gone before he used one of them, and charging her with theft and illegal practice had been, from his perspective, a tidy solution to a small problem. She was not, after all, the point. She was, however, the one who had noticed the document, and the one whose cell the wolf had chewed through to reach, and the one standing in the Alpha King's study at the 4th hour of the night with a chain around her wrist and a wolf pressed to her side, reading letters that named the method and the date, which was 4 days from now. 4 days, not 30. The morning convening of the Pack Council was not voluntary. Casvin was brought in by 2 of the Alpha King's guard at the 6th hour, before the hall had fully lit, while frost still held the courtyard flagstones and the torches were burning low. He came in with the composure of a man who had prepared for many contingencies and believed he had managed this one, and he stood at the center of the great hall and looked at the assembled council and at the Alpha King's chair. Doran was already seated. Lena stood to the left of the dais, not because she had been placed there, but because Aldrich had simply gestured her to stand there, and she had, and the wolf sat at her feet with the attentiveness of an animal that has completed a task and is waiting to see what comes next. Casvin looked at her once. His composure fractured, barely, at the edges. "First Counselor," Doran said. His voice in the near-empty hall was very quiet. "The council has been asked to convene because a matter has been brought to my attention that requires public hearing before the assembled pack hierarchy." He paused. "Normally, I would allow you to speak first. In this instance, I am going to speak first." He spoke for a long time, not in anger. That was the thing about Doran. She was learning. He did not need anger as a carrier. He laid out the forged documents, the blank signed sheets, the correspondence with the Eastern Territory, the method, the date, the arrangement, with the calm specificity of someone presenting load-bearing evidence, and the council members listened in a silence that grew steadily heavier as the weight of it accumulated. Casvin attempted to speak twice. Both times Doran's hand moved, a single flat gesture, and Casvin stopped. When it was done, the senior council member, an older woman named Brev, who had outlasted 2 Alpha Kings, stood and looked at the documents herself, and then looked at Casvin and said, in a voice like dry stone, "First Counselor, you have betrayed your pack. Do you deny it?" Casvin did not deny it. He made, instead, a speech about the good of the territory and the limitations of the current leadership, and no one in the hall looked at him while he made it, which was its own kind of verdict. Brev named the sentence herself. The hall confirmed it. Casvin was stripped of office, stripped of title, and would be held to await a formal trial before the Northern Alliance Council, whose jurisdiction covered crimes of this magnitude. He was taken out by the guards without further ceremony, and the hall was quiet for a moment in the way that halls are quiet when something large has fallen. Then Doran stood. He came down from the dais. He walked across the floor of the great hall to where Lena stood beside the wolf, and he stopped in front of her. And every head in the room turned, and the assembled hierarchy of the Vornpak watched in collective held breath as the Alpha King reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a small key. He unlocked the chain at her wrist. He held it for a moment. The chain coiled in his hand, looking at the red mark the iron had left on her skin, and something moved through his face that he did not attempt to contain this time. "Lena," he said. Just her name. No honorific. No qualification. Just her name in his voice, and the hall was so quiet that the word reached every corner. "She is not without Pack," he said, and his voice had shifted, lifted into the register of formal proclamation, addressed not to her, but to the assembled room. "She has not been without Pack for 8 days. She has been without acknowledgement." He paused. "That ends now." The wolf stood at her feet. Its tail moved once, deliberate. Aldrich went to one knee first. He did it simply, without theater, as a man confirms a fact he has known for some time. Then the senior council member Brev, and she was old enough that the motion was slow and effortful and carried more weight because of it. Then the junior council, then the hall, row by row, the assembled hierarchy of Vorn Bending where 3 weeks ago they had watched a woman chained to a ring in the wall. She stood in the center of the hall and let it happen, and did not look away from Doran's face. She did not speak. Her vindication was delivered by 300 kneeling witnesses, not her mouth, and she knew the difference between those things. "There is one matter remaining," Doran said, still to the hall, still in the formal register, though his eyes had not left hers. "I want the Pack to witness it. I will not do this privately." He went to one knee, the Alpha King of Vorn, before his assembled hierarchy, on the cold flagstone floor of the great hall where she had been chained. She did not move for a moment. "You could have told me," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "About the wolf. Any of the 8 nights." "I know," he said. "I was afraid of what you would do with it." "Afraid of me?" "Afraid," he said, "that you would refuse." She looked at him for a long time, this man who had sat in a carved chair and let a lock click shut, and had spent 8 nights afterwards unable to stop what he was. "That was not a refusal," she said, "following your wolf into a corridor in the middle of the night." He looked up at her. The ghost of something in his face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "No," he said. "I suppose it was not." She put her hand on his and he rose. The spring came early that year, or so the village keepers recorded. The iron moon passed, and the thaw fires were lit on schedule, and the Vorn territory settled into the business of a new order. A new first counselor was named, the Eastern correspondence handed to the Northern Alliance as evidence in an ongoing case, the records of Lena's charges formally expunged, and the warden's cell documentation sealed. Casvin's trial took place 3 months after the Iron Moon, before a tribunal of Alliance Council members, and the verdict was not gentle. She did not attend. She did not need to. In the healer's ward, Doss had a new assistant whose designation was no longer aide, but healer proper. Formally licensed, formally affiliated. Her name entered into the Pack registry in Doran's own hand. The entry noted, in the careful record-keeping language of the Northern Packs, that she held dual standing, Pack healer and bonded mate to the Alpha King of Vorn, recognized under seal on the 14th day after the Iron Moon, in the 43rd year of the Vorn count, before 300 witnesses who had also signed. She kept the copper mortar, her mother's, from the old satchel. It sat on the shelf in the room she now occupied in the keep's upper corridor, alongside a collection of dried roots and a worn leather binding of Braille's notes, and sometimes when the hall was busy and the morning was cold, Doran came and stood in the doorway and watched her work, and said nothing, because he had said the one necessary thing in the hall before 300 witnesses, and had not needed to say more. The wolf slept in a patch of winter light on the stone floor, long and still, head on its paws, entirely at rest. The chain was gone. The mark on her wrist had faded by the time the first thaw crocus pushed through the courtyard frost. She noticed its absence one morning while mixing a poultice and felt, briefly, the shape of its presence, and then let it go. Aldrich, passing the doorway, nodded at her. She nodded back. A small thing, the world's ordinary grammar which she had been outside of for long enough that she noticed being inside it again. She was inside it now. The door was open. That was enough.